Afternoon. I want to welcome everyone to today's webinar. This is part of our Best Practices for Backyard Chickens webinar series that we'll be hosting on Thursdays the next 3 weeks at 1 o'clock. Today is session 1, and we really appreciate you for joining us. I'm Jenna Neese, and I'm the A&R educator in Putnam County, and I also serve as the adult education coordinator for the Putnam County Soil and Water Conservation District. This program is being put on by the Area 5 A&R educators. We all work for Purdue University, and we are located in Greene, Monroe, Clay-and-Owen, Vigo, Vermilion, Putnam, Sullivan, and Park County. On the screen, you can see the different A&R educators located in each of the counties, along with our contact information. You'll meet a few of us throughout this program series as we're going to take turns presenting. We are recording this webinar series so that we can send the recordings to you to view at home for those that have missed the live version and if anyone wants to review them. At the end of our webinar series, we will be sending out a survey to evaluate how much information you gained and whether we should continue doing programs like this. Now, throughout the course of the program, we urge you to ask any questions you might have in the chat box. The chat box is located on the right-hand side of your screen. When typing there, please set the to everyone so that we can make sure everyone is able to see what questions are getting asked. Or I guess it's not everyone, it's all attendees as the correct lingo that's being used. But without further ado, I will introduce today's presenter. And like I said, today is the first session of the series, and we will send out a separate webinar link for each of the sessions. But the first series, our first session is What Bird is Right for Me, and the presenter is Amy Thompson. She is the Monroe County A&R educator, and I believe she is ready to go with her presentation.
Ginger, can we switch screen sharing to my screen so you don't have to mess with advancing my slides, please and thank you. And good afternoon, everybody. Okay, let me get the presentation brought up here again real quick. Oh, shoot. And we'll get caught back up to that slide there. Okay, thank you. This afternoon, we're going to talk about what bird is right for me. I have about 12 years as a backyard bird keeper. Got into it because my husband wanted birds, and also we were looking for a livestock project for our children to be involved with, and this was a relatively low input starter project for our kids, and we continue to keep them now, even though the kids have sort of lost interest because we enjoy the eggs and occasionally the meat, and enjoy also the self-sufficiency factor involved in, producing our own food. So we're going to talk about some characteristics of different birds that you might want to consider as you're selecting birds for your backyard. And then we'll briefly talk about getting birds and being prepared for your birds at home. And then obviously in the next 2 sessions, you'll learn about additional information on caring for your birds and then housing and protecting your birds. So with that, with any project, it's always a good idea to think about what your goals are. Are you mainly interested in eggs? Or do you want to try and produce some of your own meat, and do you live in an area where that is a potential possibility? Do you want the benefits of having both eggs and meat? Do you have an interest in a particular breed because you've heard that it might be somewhat in peril because of its numbers, or do you want some birds that are particularly calm for your kids or grandkids to handle? So those are all things that you might want to think about, and we're going to talk. We're going to talk about some of those options. There are lots and lots of options with chickens, and even though I've been keeping chickens for a long time, or a relatively long time, you know, there's always still more information to learn. And I learned a few things in developing this presentation as well. So, and I also know people who are backyard chicken keepers who have moved to breeding, you know, selecting traits from particular varieties and breeding for something that they're particularly interested in. I will say that much of my personal education has come from being involved in our 4-H program. We had the benefit of really great 4-H poultry club leaders for our family, and they actually did genetic research on feather color and some other qualities in chickens, so they were a really great resource for us in learning. And chicken keepers in general are friendly, helpful people, and they love to talk about chickens. So, you know, if your family might be interested in that, it's definitely something to check out. Okay, so things to think about when you're thinking about what kind of chicken you want. If you're interested in egg production, is there a size of egg? There is some variability even within the large breeds on the sizes of eggs. Are you interested in a particular color? Do you have a preference for white eggs, or will you only eat, you know, your husband will only eat brown eggs because that's what he grew up eating? There's some really beautiful dark brown eggs out there, and of course the colored eggs or the Easter egger breeds are often of interest to people because they're beautiful. Fewer of you are probably thinking about meat production, but there are things to consider there as well. You know, chickens actually have different skin color, can be yellow or white skin. There's even black skin chickens. Are you particularly, you know, does your family really love chicken breasts and that's the kind of meat that you're really focused on? Or my husband really likes the dark meat, and that's what he's more interested in. So those are some considerations as you think about your breeds. Chickens have been domesticated for a long, long time, and we've taken that domestication opportunity and customized them for what we're looking for in lots of different ways. And in that process, you know, we've gone about naming them. Excuse me. And when chickens are described or named, they're typically classified into groups based on size, the place where the particular breed or variety originated, the color and or feather pattern, and then sex as well as age. So it can seem a little overwhelming if you're a brand new chicken person and you're talking to somebody who you know, has quite a bit of experience, and they're telling you, you know, it's a Mediterranean large fowl with a rose comb and you know, barred feathers. That might be a little overwhelming, but once you understand the system a little bit, it gets a little clearer, and you don't necessarily need to know all that information. You can keep it simple too, and still do quite well with your egg production or whatever you're looking for. This classification does become important to understand if you did ever want to get into chicken exhibition I mentioned, youth programs related to chickens, but there are quite a few adults who are involved in exhibiting chickens and also breeding and selling chickens. So they may be a source of birds for you somewhere down the line as well. As far as the classification of sizes of chickens, there's basically two sizes, either the standard or large fowl. Large fowl and standard are considered the same, and we would think of those as normal sized birds. And then there's bantam birds, and you can see standard or large fowl Brahma here, I believe, is the breed, and then also a bantam. And the bantams are just a miniature sized chicken, mostly a miniature of a larger breed, although there are a couple breeds like silkies and modern game birds that do not have large breed companions, shall we say. People typically think of bantams as more ornamental. You're including them because you're interested in exhibiting them, or you're interested in, just having a flock perhaps to forage in a section of your yard, or, just keeping them almost as pets. Some do have good egg production. We have had bantam chickens, and although the eggs are obviously smaller, we did get regular egg production out of them, and really enjoyed having them as well. When you get to class, on the terminology of naming chickens or describing chickens, that typically refers to where groups of birds were developed. So the different classes include American, Asiatic, English, Mediterranean, continental, and then a whole long list of other standard breeds. The Standard of Perfection is a book that's put out by the, I believe it's the American Poultry Association, and it describes all these different breeds. It's sort of like the American Kennel Association with dogs. So if you're really into that, getting a copy, into learning more about that, getting a copy of that book is the place to start. Once we move past class, you get into the breeds of different birds. And the breeds are differentiated by body size, skin color, perhaps the number of toes, perhaps the feathers, whether they have feathers present on their shanks or not. And here is a list of different English breeds like Orpington. A lot of people have heard of Buff Orpingtons. They are an English breed, or Sussex is another English breed. So that's how the breed names come around, and then variety comes into place when you're talking about the feather color or the pattern that you find in the feathers, or also the type of comb. So there's the comb is this, the comb, if I can find my cursor, is right here. We'll have a better picture, but it's the fleshy part that stands up on top of the head. We'll have a better picture later in the presentation, but combs can vary to a pea comb, a single comb, a double comb, a rose comb, lots of different combs, and then feathers. There's barred feathers is the one that's coming to mind immediately, but there's lots of different feather descriptions as well. So here's two different varieties of, actually three different varieties of one breed. So the breed is an Orpington, but the variety it changes by color. So we have a black Orpington here, a buff Orpington, and then here is a lavender Orpington. So Another term that you might want to get familiar with as you work to select what kind of chickens you're interested in is brooding or broodiness, or what's called a broody hen. A hen that is broody is one that at least is willing to sit on eggs and hatch them, and some of them very much want to sit on eggs and hatch them, and can become broody and spend all their time in the nest when you're not interested necessarily in having them hatch eggs, and or the eggs may not be fertile for them to hatch. So it can be a good thing, and it can also be a little bit of a problem on occasion, but it does play a role in their maternal instincts, and if you want to perhaps get started with some birds and then breed your own by having the hens themselves hatch them, then you may want to consider the broody characteristics of that particular breed. Let me catch up with my notes here for just a second. So something else to know about hens, they typically, we'll talk a little bit about this later in the presentation, once they're mature and have begun laying, they may take a little time to begin laying regularly, but they typically lay, you know, around an egg a day. But she doesn't actually start incubating eggs until the whole clutch is laid. If you ever plan on developing a little business selling eggs, or you know, you want to give eggs to your family and friends and neighbors, then it might not be good to have hens that are particularly broody, because they lay less eggs and they want to sit around and mother those eggs instead. And then some breeds really aren't characterized as being broody at all. They have very little interest in spending any time in the nest box or on top of the eggs. That's something to look for as well. And I believe we have a chart later in the that talks a little bit about that. I know we talk about it when we get to the different breeds. Another term that you might want to consider as you're thinking about selecting your birds is forage. Forage is the ability of birds to seek out and find their own feed. As the slide says there, some birds are more active and will forage more readily. They're happy to be out looking for bugs and, scratching around. Other hens will wait on you to feed them. They don't really actively forage, and there's not a whole lot that you can do to necessarily encourage that behavior if it's not something that's not sort of innate within that breed. So that's something to think about, you know, depending on what kind of system you want to set up with your housing. Are your birds going to have space to forage? Are they a foraging type and you should provide space for them to forage because they'll be happier, more content bird, and, when the animals are happier, they are more productive. So that is something to consider as well. What kind of setup you have, and then what kind of setup fits the breed that you're considering. Some other things to think about, we're talking about chickens in Indiana, but it's funny how information gets passed around, and this presentation, I believe, is being recorded, so who knows where it will end up. But climate is a factor. Some chickens do better in cold areas than others. Most chickens can tolerate cold actually better than they can tolerate heat. When we see chickens really stressed, it's typically under hot conditions. There are breeds that are a little more adapted to warmer conditions. the Mediterranean breeds obviously were developed under warmer conditions, more humid conditions, so they might be a good choice. Also, birds with large combs can perform better in hot areas than they do necessarily in cool areas. Large combs on birds are susceptible to frostbite, and frostbite can impact fertility and just overall health of the bird as well. So if you do choose a large combed breed, you're going to have to be conscious of that if we do get very cold weather. We're going to talk about housing, of course, in that third session, and I'm sure they will discuss everything that a bird in Indiana needs to get through the winter. But as with most things, if you provide them shelter where they can get out of the wind and clean bedding, they can do relatively well under normal Indiana weather conditions. Extreme weather may be a different situation, and you might need to modify their housing a bit to accommodate for those extreme occasions. But in general, you know, like I said, you give them the right situation and they're happy, they will do well. I don't know about you, but I have a very vivid memory of being chased all over a farm lot when I was a 5-year-old by a mean rooster who was going to flog the crud out of me. And with my children, we've also had some very aggressive roosters, and it becomes a problem. So temperament is another consideration, and it does vary somewhat by breed, and you can see on this chart here sort of an array of temperament, the aggressive ones that you may want to avoid, especially as a new bird keeper or modern game bird in Sumatra. The aggressive ones we had were Americanas. They were not only aggressive with us, but also aggressive with each other. So they were fighting all the time. Those were some eggs that we hatched out, so we ended up, unfortunately, with quite a few roosters, and we definitely had to thin the herd in that case because it just became an issue with my children caring for the birds, which was part of the reason for having the birds, and then also they were ending up, as I mentioned, fighting way too frequently. We've also had Orpingtons, and they were very calm and easy to be around. We've had Delawares, also great temperament, I think. We had speckled Sussex, which I do not see on the list, and you know, that bird practically hopped in my son's lap at any opportunity, and really was very much a pet. So there's a lot of variety there, and of course this is a guideline. That's not to say you won't run into the occasional aggressive Orpington or the occasional easy to handle modern game bird, but it does give you something to think about as you work towards selecting a breed. I mentioned earlier breed preservation. If that's something you're interested in, the American Livestock Breed Conservancy has a list of poultry breeds which are either of concern or you know, their populations appear to be threatened. It's really a pretty fun site to check out anyway. It's listed here, but we'll also be sending you a resource list following this program, and that link is included there. So, you know, as you're thinking about your breeds, you might want to just visit this site and check out what they have to say, and you know, additional considerations that you might want to think about when you're selecting birds. a little bit more on how those birds get listed in the American Livestock Breed Conservancy list. So they only list American birds, or traditional U.S. poultry species, chickens, ducks, geese, and turkeys. We're only talking about chickens today, but there are other options. They list bantam breeds if there is no large fowl component, and then they have several rankings that include critical, threatened, watch, and recovering. So, you know, like I said, you can check it out for more information, but it's pretty interesting. Moving sort of on to particular types of chickens, dual-purpose chickens. We mentioned them at the beginning. You know, they're not necessarily selected for egg production or meat production, but have characteristics that are good for both of those goals. And so they lay a reasonable number of eggs and still produce a good carcass if that's something that you're interested in. And when you do make selections, you know, when you're selecting for egg size and production, you're basically making selections against putting that energy into body growth and meat production. But these birds that I'm going to give you an overview of are good dual-purpose breeds that you might want to consider, especially as you're starting out. So here's the dual-purpose breeds that I'm going to go over. We won't really talk much about the different egg-laying breeds and meat birds. We'll talk a little bit about meat birds, but we will, in that resource list, also provide you with a couple hatcheries that you can, you know, we're not, you know, endorsing them necessarily for purchasing chickens. You can do your own research and make your own selection about where you want to get your birds. And there are local auctions as well. But those websites do have a lot of good information on, you know, the different breeds and also care and feeding and housing and all kinds of information there for your reference. So even if you don't necessarily want to buy from them, it might be a good idea to go ahead and check out their websites just to see what you might be able to learn from them. So here, as I mentioned, are the dual-purpose breeds we're going to talk about, and this one right here is known as a Wyandotte. Rhode Island Reds, they were developed in Massachusetts and Rhode Island in the early 1900s. They're red or white in color. The adult size, as you can see, 5.5 to 8.5 pounds. The shell color is brown to dark brown if egg color is important to you. This breed is actually sort of a foundation breed for a lot of modern hybrids, including the sex-linked birds. Often they're used more for meat than eggs, but they will lay well through moderate cold weather. They're good foragers, they're calm, they're friendly, and they're tough, which is, you know, you get into some of the other breeds that we're not going to spend a lot of time on, like the silkies or the modern game birds, and they can be pretty delicate. And at least in my house, being tough is a good thing. So this is one to consider. Plymouth Rock, developed in America in the middle of the 19th century. There's lots of varieties. With this one, this is a barred rock. You've probably heard of barred rocks. People don't say the full name, so you don't get barred Plymouth Rock, you just get barred rock, and the barred is a reference to the feathers being barred. So these little lines on the feathers are where that comes from. And as you can see here, you've also got silver penciled, blue Colombian. These are a little smaller than the Rhode Island Red, 4 to 7 pounds. The eggshell color is brown. And I will show you a slide a little later that talks about how you can determine egg color just looking at a chicken, well, how you can generally determine egg color just looking at a chicken. These guys are good. They're a good general farm or backyard chicken. They have good mothering instincts, so they've got a little bit of that broodiness. They are not particularly good foragers, so if that's a characteristic you're looking for, you know, this may not be the breed for you. These guys were utilized to produce some of the modern broiler strains. So, you know, meat production is definitely part of their genetics. We've had Barred Rocks and a white Plymouth Rock Bantam, and they were great birds. The white Plymouth Rock Bantam was a beautiful, beautiful bird. I just loved seeing that bird forage out in our yard. It was fun. Even though they're not listed as great foragers, he did make the rounds for sure. He made the rounds so far. Unfortunately, he was eventually taken out by a hawk in our barn lot, but really nice birds to have. Dominique, these guys are considered the oldest American breed. And, you know, where those bloodlines go before that, there's some speculation there. You see the adult size there, and again, their color, or the egg color is brown. A good dual-purpose bird for meat and eggs. These guys are good foragers. They have sort of moderate broodiness. They are calm birds to have around. And this is where, when you aren't necessarily a chicken person, telling a Dominique from a Barred Rock, you know, it's like splitting Pink Lady apples and I don't know what other variety, but it can be a little different if you're not super familiar with things, because they obviously look similar to the Barred Rocks. This is a Delaware. You can see how it was developed there. An off-colored barred Plymouth Rock with a New Hampshire female. These are slightly larger birds. Their adult size is 6 to 9 pounds. We've had several of these very calm birds. They're relatively fast growing and therefore good for meat production, but also have good laying characteristics. This is definitely a breed that I would consider getting again. That, you know, we did have Delaware roosters, no fighting issues with them, no aggression towards my kids. So we had a good experience with them for sure. Wyandottes, originally from New York, developed in the late 1800s. Again, lots of varieties there. Silver Lace Wyandottes is probably one of the most common ones, but there are several out there. Adult size 5.5 to 8.5. Their eggshell color is brown, but there is some variety in there. This bird does well in colder climates. You can see the small comb on the birds. It doesn't particularly tolerate the heat well, so keep that in mind. This one is often bred as an exhibition or show bird. I used to work the Indiana State Fair poultry show quite often, and yes, all these varieties were definitely represented, and many, many Silver Lace Wyandottes would be entered in the Indiana State Fair. Brahma is a very large bird. As you can see, the adult size is 8 to 12 pounds, and one thing that's different about them that hopefully you can notice in the slide, even on the chick, is that their legs are feathered. You can definitely see it on the big guy here. those are the size, the big head, the feathered legs are constant characteristics of the Brahmas. They're relatively slow growing, but they are, large birds when you get to that adult size. They do well in cool climates because of the heavy feathering. They talk a lot. They're very vocal birds, and that does also vary by breed a little bit. They're good foragers. They have some moderate mothering instincts. So, if you're interested in hatching birds, this is one you might consider. I love the size of them, and I've always been interested in having some Brahmas, but the feathered leg issue, they get dirty, and they carry the mud around on their feathers and that kind of thing, and that was not something that I necessarily wanted to mess with, so that's why we've never ended up with any of those. Orpingtons, originally from England, they're an English breed. As we mentioned earlier in that chart, they're a relatively big bird, sort of a square shape when I think of them. They have a lot of loose feathering, very fluffy birds. They're good for meat and egg production, as all of these are that we're talking about. They have good mothering instincts. We have hatched Orpingtons from hen incubated eggs. They are calm birds for sure. At least that's their characteristic in my experience as well. They don't particularly forage well. They'll wander around your yard, but they don't, or their chicken yard, but they don't necessarily seek out food particularly well. Because of all that fluff, they can have some cleanliness issues as well, so something to think about. Also something to think about, that cleanliness issue with any of these birds. One of the things about backyard chickens is people like to handle them and hold them and show them off to their neighbors and kids, and we've all learned the importance of hand washing and had it reinforced here lately, but when you're handling birds, it is important to wash your hands before and after handling them. They do occasionally have issues with salmonella and other pathogens as well, so just for your bird's health and your health, be conscientious about that when you are handling them, for sure. So those are some dual purpose breeds. Real quickly, as far as meat breeds go, they're birds that will produce a great carcass, and they grow typically incredibly fast. And they're definitely not bred for producing eggs. So don't buy meat birds and expect much egg production. What this picture shows here is an Orpington chick on the left and a Cornish cross, which is a well-known meat bird on the right. And these birds are both the same age. They're 5 weeks old. So you can see the growth rate, the difference in the growth rate between this meat bird and the dual purpose bird, illustrated pretty well there in that slide. Some meat breeds here. The Cornish crosses and then these Freedom Rangers are probably the two most common types of meat breeds. The Freedom Rangers have been developed relatively recently, at least to my knowledge, and I believe they were developed because people were interested in getting a meat bird that did have good foraging characteristics. So, if you have a big backyard and you want your backyard poultry to be pastured, but you do want to produce meat birds, this is something, the Freedom Rangers might be something that you consider, because they will forage and do well on pastures or, a substantial yard. The Cornish crosses, don't forage much. They're not very active birds, and they actually do have some stability and leg issues because of their rate of growth. So something to check into as you're investigating meat birds, if that's something you're interested in learning more about. And I just quickly want to mention the fast rate of growth in meat birds is because they have been bred for that characteristic, to be able to put on body weight quickly. You know, they're not sending their energy to reproduction, they're sending it to production of meat. I do have a couple of resources on that handout we're going to send to you that talk you through the home processing process, and then also there's a YouTube video about you know, some of the equipment and other things you might want to need, so, or might be interested in if you're interested in pursuing a meat production. I will say, if you're interested in pursuing meat production, do not have the expectation that you are going to find someone to process the birds for you. Very few businesses in Indiana do that, and when they do, they give their attention to high volume poultry producers. They're not going to want to process one or two backyard birds. I will say this is another opportunity to perhaps connect with your 4-H club, your 4-H leaders, to learn about the process. I know our 4-H club in the past actually had sort of a butchering education day where people could bring birds, learn about the process, perhaps you know, butcher one of their own, and go through the entire process under guidance. So again, you might want to connect with your local poultry leaders. As far as egg layers, I mentioned earlier, you get quite a bit of egg production once the birds reach the productive stage, which is around 6 months. They around, you know, an egg a day. If you had 6 chickens, you'd probably get 4 eggs a day on average. They direct a lot of their energy into that reproduction, so the meat, the carcass, is not nearly as interesting. Here's a bunch of different egg-laying breeds. So Foghorn Leghorn was an egg-laying breed, and if you say Leghorn, folks will know you're a poultry novice, because all the poultry veterans say Leghorn, and it takes you a minute to figure out what they're talking about. But you've got lots of different breeds here. Some of the colored eggs, Araucana, Americana, Australorp, produce some of those tinted colored eggs. But egg color, one way you can determine egg color is in general, so here's the ear on a bird, and this is the earlobe. If the earlobe is white, then the bird will produce white eggs. If the earlobe is red, the bird will produce typically brown eggs. So legend has it back in the day that New Yorkers preferred white eggs and folks from Boston preferred brown eggs, and that's how some of the breeds were developed, breeding around you know, locality and preference on the egg color. Sometimes brown eggs are thought of as more natural or healthier. The answer to that is no. There is really no difference in the nutritional content of the eggs, and certainly brown eggs can be laid under caged conditions. You know, it doesn't have necessarily have anything to do with how the birds were raised. People do have that perception that brown eggs maybe are more natural or healthier, so sometimes they tend to be more expensive than white eggs. But as I mentioned, no real difference if because of egg color. If there is a nutritional difference, it comes from differences in hen nutrition, you know, what they are fed and what that feed contains, and that can result in, you know, different composition of the egg nutrition itself. Here's a chart that sort of breaks down the egg color. The blue-greens down here, the dark browns. If you're not familiar with these are really pretty colored eggs. So, you know, if that's important to you, something to consider. When you're selecting your birds, you have lots of options. If you get them through mail order, you're going to have likely more options than you will if you choose to buy them at the farm store, at Tractor Supply, or, you know, Rural King, or even some local hardware stores carry eggs now because it's quite popular backyard chicken keeping. You can get eggs from other producers as well. You know, if you don't want to go through the process of raising chicks, that's typically what's sold in the farm store and often what's sold through mail order. You can buy like 4-week-old chicks and pullets through mail order, and some of the other producers, local producers, are often willing to sell pullets, or pullets, is a young female bird, are often willing to sell pullets or even mature hens. Of course, those are going to be much more costly than the day-old chicks, just because of the investment that folks have in raising them. And you might be able to get a 4-H'er if you don't want to mess with raising chicks. You don't want to invest in the setup that you need to raise chicks. You know, potentially reach out again to your local 4-H club, and some of those older 4-H'ers might be willing to raise chicks for you and then sell them to you as hens. So I know in our county some folks have done that. Do you need roosters? Well, if you're only interested in eggs, no, you do not. You do not need eggs for hens, or you do not need roosters for hens to produce eggs. If you're interested in producing chicks, as in having your hens incubate fertile eggs, you will need a rooster. You need a rooster in order to produce fertilized eggs. When you order through mail order, or sometimes the signs at the farm store, you'll see it says straight run. Straight run means the birds are not sexed, so you're likely to get 50% females and 50% males. So consider that when you're thinking about what you want to buy. Perhaps you might want to consider, if you're going to do a straight run, are those birds typically calm, or are they flighty or aggressive? Because, you know, like I mentioned earlier, aggressive, if you're, even, you know, birds have been aggressive with me as an adult, and you have to be ready to intimidate them back, or they will take advantage of that. And they also can end up fighting. So you may want to, you know, just order female chicks in order to avoid having to deal with roosters. So again, you know, you have options. Do you want chicks? Do you want pullets or young immature females? Do you want hens? Do you want to order eggs and try to incubate them with an incubator? Done that. It's a fabulous learning experience, whether you're young or old, but it's also sort of messy and stinky. You know, if you want that experience, something to consider. If you don't, you know, you have other options. When you do get birds, they're often day-old chicks, and it's important to realize that you'll be caring for those chicks for about 6 months for them to produce eggs. So, you know, the time it takes them to mature to where they can be reach a reproductive stage is around 6 months. I mentioned earlier, purchasing from commercial hatcheries does have some additional options that you might be interested in. They often have more variety available. They sometimes will provide vaccinations for your birds. They have to be part of the National Poultry Improvement Program, which means they're monitoring for disease and doing other things to ensure we maintain healthy bird populations in the United States. Some of the issues buying from commercial hatcheries is often they may charge you quite a bit if you want less than, say, 25 birds. If you just want 4 or 5 birds, the farm store may be a better option, or, you know, you may need to find some friends who are also interested in keeping birds and submit a collective order so that you can get that discounted price. And I mentioned the farm stores already, and lots of options to purchase or trade from other local producers. You find those adult poultry exhibitors, and, you know, if they don't have the bird you're looking for, I bet you they know who does produce the kind of bird you're looking for, and can either sell you chicks or breeding birds. And here's just a list. This is taken from Murray McMurray, which is one of the commercial hatcheries on the list, and I again mentioned no endorsement necessarily, but it just gives you an example of what's available as far as the older chicks and pullets that you might want to order. When you do get your chicks, or actually before you get your chicks, please have a brooder set up and ready to care for your chicks. Brooders can be developed from lots of different things. We've used plastic pools. We've used old water troughs when we had very few chicks that we were trying to brood. You can use brooder rings like things here. Seen people lay out giant cardboard boxes, build brooders, such as this. They do need bedding. Typically, folks use either chopped straw or wood shavings. I mentioned that I learned a few things myself in preparing this presentation, but one suggestion that I read from a University of Iowa publication was to put shredded newspaper on top of the wood shavings to start with, because the chicks will not try to eat the newspaper while they will eat some shavings. As far as space for the brooder goes, you need about a half a square foot per bird to start with. You'll need a brooder light or some type of brooding heater that keeps the birds at 90 to 95 degrees during the first week. They do not have the ability to regulate their body temperature when they're very young, so that's what the lamp is for. You have to be regulating their temperature for them. Typically, you'd want the bulb about 18 inches from the floor. You can do red or clear bulbs. We've done both and haven't noticed a whole lot of difference. But again, something I read in preparing this was that that University of Iowa publication again mentioned that you might see less chicks picking on other chicks when you use a red light. I may have to run a little experiment myself and see if that is the case. You'd want one bulb per 0 to 50 chicks in cold weather, about one bulb to 0 to 100 chicks in warm weather. And then as they mature in age, you would lower the temperature about 5 degrees a week until you get to 70 degrees. You also want to try and prevent, you want ventilation, you want air moving, but you don't want necessarily drafts. If the chicks get chilled, as we already said, they can't regulate their own body temperature. If they get chilled, they'll stop moving around. They might not move under the light in order to get warmer. So preventing drafts and also keeping your bedding dry, changing the bedding frequently is important. If you don't have a thermometer necessarily to take temperature, this is a way just by observing bird behavior that you can get an idea if things are looking pretty good as far as temperature goes. If you're about right as far as the temperature goes, your chicks will be distributed throughout the brooding space. As you can see here in the lower right-hand corner, if they're too hot, they will get as far as away from the light as possible. If they're too cold, they will get as close and get as much intense heat under the light as possible. And then if you see drafts, they're going to move themselves away to try and avoid that draft as possible. So, you know, observing bird behavior is going to be important throughout the lifetime of your bird. Checking your birds regularly is going to be important throughout the lifetime of your bird. These are not necessarily an animal that, you know, don't think of them as cats, is where you can leave them for 2 or 3 days and they'll be fine. They need regular care and always fresh water. They should have feed available to them all the time as well. I mentioned the fresh water. They have to learn to drink. They are put into, if you're buying them through mail order, they're put into those packing boxes very soon after hatching, you know, depending, they're shipped priority mail. The post office calls you to come pick them up, but they need a drink really quickly after that. They need to figure out how to drink. So get your brooder set up, dip their beaks in the water before turning them loose in the brooder. You don't want the brooder, or excuse me, the water directly under the brooder light or even particularly close. You want things spaced out and spread out, both the waters and the feeding trays, so that they have access to it all the time and don't necessarily have to be directly under the heat to get to it. They tend to like cool water better. That's true for adult chickens as well. You know, try and avoid just leaving them with hot water if you're dealing with hot temperatures. An estimate, you know, 1 gallon of water per 50 chicks per day. Make sure you use the type of water that the chicks cannot get themselves into. Again, if they get wet or get chilled, they're going to struggle a little bit, stress them out, and stress can snowball into bigger problems. And they can also drown, so you definitely do want to pay attention to the type of water you're using. And here's a couple, a photo with both a water and a chick feeder as an example. Starter feed, you can find chick starter. It has a good amount of protein to help the birds develop. Often what you can find is medicated. Sometimes it's difficult to find unmedicated feed in the stores. The medicated part is to prevent coccidiosis, which is a disease that's caused by a protozoan. So it's a single-celled animal, basically. And coccidiosis is a common killer of chickens, especially chicks. And they get infected through ingesting fecal matter. So another reason to also keep your brooder cleaned and or freshened with new bedding, and sanitation of waters and feeders and the whole setup is important to prevent this disease. So it's not an antibiotic. A lot of people, are concerned about antibiotics with reason. But again, it prevents this protozoan, which is a single-cell animal, from infecting the bird and the development of coccidiosis. So you will keep your birds in the brooder. Not that they don't ever get out of the brooder, but you need to monitor the temperature of the day and the conditions, et cetera. But you would start transitioning them to the coop when they are fully feathered, like these pullets here, or these young birds here are. So that's around 6 weeks. Again, you also will be lowering that brooder temperature so that they can transition into not needing that light bulb. I mentioned 70 degrees before. You might even move to less than that because they're going to likely be exposed to lower nighttime temperatures, sorry. So if you already have birds, introducing new birds to your flock, it should be done with care. The whole pecking order, that is a very true euphemism. Birds can be quite vicious, so just be cautious and careful, do the transition over time. Some people suggest introducing new birds at night and locking them up in the coop together because everybody sort of sleeps together and ta-da, oh, in the morning, we've all been together forever. I haven't particularly found that to be quite true, but anything you can do to transition them slowly. Otherwise, that pecking order, older birds attacking your newer birds is very likely to happen. And then, you'll also be transitioning them to a layer feed or a different type of a meat bird feed, if that's what you're going for, that would have a higher, a different nutrient makeup than a layer feed. But so that's sort of what I have for you. You're going to get a lot more information in the next 2 sessions. I, of course, took up all the time with the actual presentation, but those of you that can stay for the questions will stay on and do our best to answer questions for you. Quickly, we do have another upcoming series on pond care and stocking. So if you're interested, check that out. That will get to you. Thank you for joining us, and we will switch our mode a little bit and work through the questions. And please feel free to type those in the chat if you haven't already, and we'll get through there. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Amy. I'll start reading off the questions, and the first one I'm going to reword a little bit different, but are there chicken breeds that do best in mixed companies? For example, do some prefer to be with other species like goats and some not?
I don't actually have a good answer to that question. I don't have a good answer to that question either from research or personal experience. I would go for those more docile breeds for sure. I mean, certainly like the Buff Orpingtons and the Delawares were around our dogs, and would forage down around our pigs and didn't really seem to have a lot of issues with it. The more flighty birds would be ones to avoid, but specific breeds that any research is available for, I'm not aware of a good answer for that one. Sorry.
All right, does any of our other panelists have any thoughts?
I would just agree with Amy that the more docile birds and the ones that are more likely to forage may handle a barnyard setting a little bit better, the slightly tougher ones.
All right, our next question is, the individual is curious as to what breed most egg companies use.
Most what companies?
Egg companies.
Egg companies. Oh, shoot. Brooke, do you know the answer to that? I should know. It's on the tip of my tongue. There are a couple different varieties, but I'm blanking. I'm sorry. We will find out that answer and put it on the resource page. How does that sound?
Sounds like a plan. The next question. I have a chicken who showed up at my front door in 2016. She has adopted us. We have created a nice home for her and added 2 friends. I would like to know what the lifespan of an average chicken might be.
Lifespan of an average chicken. They can live quite a long time. Typically, people end up, because they aren't necessarily treated like pets, people end up utilizing them for their stew pot, or once they stop laying, or predation ends up becoming a factor. I don't know if my colleagues have a direct answer on average age of a chicken, but I would say, we've had some 6-year-old chickens for sure. So, and they're ladies who are no longer laying with any regularity at all, but we appreciate them and sort of just have them around. Google says 5 to 10 years. So, like I said, we've had some 6-year-old chickens, and I've also lost track of how old some of them are. So.
Okay. Next, you mentioned differences among breeds to consider for egg, meat, temperament, temperature tolerance. What about disease or parasite resistance?
So disease and parasite resistance is largely based on the cultural factors, the conditions in which you're keeping your birds, as far as, maintaining, providing a good nutrition program, fresh water, adequate space, protecting them from stress like, cold winds, that kind of thing. Anything that can stress a chicken can make them more susceptible to disease and or parasites. So I don't know of specific breeds that are particularly more resistant, but you certainly have a large impact on your poultry, your flock's health. And that's definitely why we're devoting a whole session to flock health next time. And if anybody else wants to chime in on that one, please feel free to do so.
All right. The next question is, I am considering 3 buff Orpingtons and 3 black Australorp chicks. They will all be chicks when I get them. The buff Australorps will be about a week older. Will they do well together?
So the week difference for very young chicks may make some difference in the first few days in the brooder for sure. So I would just be cautious and watchful and be prepared to separate them if you have problems. But otherwise, you know, chickens raised together don't care about breed. So, you know, as far as their compatibility long-term, that's not an issue in my mind at all. But I would be concerned definitely at that very young age in the brooder, how the older chicks will deal with the day-olds. So
this kind of goes along with it, but does less of a variety of birds usually equal less problems? Or is it possible to have a variety of breeds live together successfully?
So I'm a crazy gardener. I want one of every plant. When we got into chickens, I wanted one of every chicken variety, and my kids were very much on board with that. In general, as long as size isn't an issue, you know, if you're dealing with all large fowl or all bantams, you'll be fine. You know, if you're trying to mix large fowl and bantams, you may have some issues. We have mixed them and did not have a lot of issues, but I'm not saying that wouldn't be the case. And although there are some cautions with it, we've also mixed turkeys with our chickens and ducks with our chickens. Again, we're not talking about turkeys and ducks necessarily in this series, and there are definitely some cautions with mixing them, but yeah, the short answer is yes, you can have a wide variety of birds and still be successful. Your biggest factors in success are going to be those cultural factors, you know, enough space, adequate food, adequate water, adequate nesting boxes. Those kind of things are bigger impacts on flock contentment than the variety mix.
Okay. I have had chicks for about 4 weeks. The Americanas and Wyandottes are almost fully feathered. My lavender still looks like a baby. Is this normal?
Huh. I'm not sure. That's one of those questions where I don't have any experience with lavenders. I would probably, in that case, turn to my local poultry connections and ask that question. And if you would like me to follow up with some of my personal local Monroe County poultry connections, I'm happy to do that. If you want to email me, afthompson@purdue.edu, so I can get that information directly back to you, I'm happy to do that. Or you can directly call our office at 812-349-2575.
Okay. Are there any vaccines besides marks that are available and or recommended?
I think we'll answer that question next week, and I think it varies somewhat by hatchery. So I'm going to leave it at that for now.
All right. So
I will also,
go ahead.
Let me add real quick. One of the resources that I list on the page is the Indiana Poultry Association. They have tons of information on biosecurity and flock health, so it's definitely something to familiarize yourself with.
At what age do hens usually stop laying?
So it's a gradual decline in laying, and even when you think they've stopped, they will occasionally surprise you and lay another egg. They lay very, very regularly. I would say pretty much for the first 2 years. Even the second year it can taper off. but it slows down pretty significantly from there on out in my experience. Does anybody have anything to add to that? Brooke or Sadie or anyone else?
Yep, that was what I was going to say. Is about 2 years is when you get the most production, and then after that, usually in a commercial setting, after that, it's not economic to keep those birds anymore. So, in a home flock where economics isn't always the driver, then, after that 2-year period, if you keep those hens, just know that you're probably not going to sell eggs as the first 2 years.
And that is something to consider when you're investing in poultry. I have had people call up and say, my hen stopped laying, what am I supposed to do with it now? There aren't hen rescues that I know of that are, lining up to take your birds that you may no longer be interested in. So, the option is definitely eating them, but some people aren't comfortable with that. So it's just something to consider. A lot of people end up giving birds away also. Although don't try, well, you can try. Good luck giving your roosters away, I will say.
From my experience, when we've had birds, it's important to have a succession plan. That way you try to keep prime producers in time all the time. Also,
yep.
On the question with the lavenders, I have some experience with those as well, and they are a slower feathering bird compared to the Americanas and Wyandottes. So that's probably the instance there. Some breeds just don't build their feathers as quick because they're working on other things, just based on breed.
All right. What are some ways to keep my chickens out of the flower beds without putting up a fence? For example, are some breeds less foragers?
Well, even the less aggressive foragers will still get in your flower beds and scratch around. They're just not quite as efficient as at actually finding food and utilizing it. So really, there's not a good solution beyond the fence for the flower beds, in my experience. I don't know if anybody else has other suggestions.
Hearing none, we'll move to the next question. Do any breeds tend to roam more than others? Do foragers tend to roam a larger territory?
My experience, that has varied more by individual bird than breed. We've had, a bunch of, different birds, and we'll have some of the same breed that will stay close to the coop, and then a few others you can see every day way far out in the pasture. That's been my experience. Other people may have different experience, and I don't really have any evidence-based information, research-based information to share on that one.
Okay. Any tricks to getting hens to utilize all nest boxes? All 6 of mine prefer only a single nest box and will drop eggs outside if it's occupied, despite having 2 additional nest boxes that are identical and open. I've even tried moving eggs into the other nests. They move them back out.
Birds are funny, so that's one thing for sure. What the patterns they get set, and the things they do, you might block off, make sure no one occupies that one particular nest box, but that is not necessarily a solution. It's just a suggestion. I don't know if Brooke or anybody else has any other ideas to offer.
My only idea, and I haven't tried this, would be, could you maybe try getting some of the ceramic eggs and fixing them into one of the other nest boxes in some way? I don't know if you could glue or something. Since I couldn't move them back, if that would stimulate them, but they are, once they get into their routine, they like to stay there. So.
How high should a fence be to keep chickens contained, assuming their flight feathers have been clipped?
Have not been clipped. So that varies a little bit by bird and breed as well. We put up bird netting, I would say about 8 feet at one point because I got so frustrated with them flying out and getting into our garden. Right now we have no bird netting and just a 4.5-foot fence, and nobody ever flies out. So the 8-foot did work well. We contained even the aggressive flyers that way, but even at that, you might get a particular individual who flies to the top of the coop and heads on out. It's one thing where you're going to have to adapt to your situation, I would say, and make some observations and be ready to be flexible. And feel free to chime in, anyone else.
Okay, I think we've got 2 more questions. The first one is there specific food you recommend for chickens? We use a mixture of layer crumbles, oats, and sometimes sunflower seeds.
So we're going to get into feed next week, I believe, as well. Food and nutrition. So I would toss that one off to next week also.
And the final question, is there such a thing as quiet rooster without using a no-crow collar? All roosters, that's instinct. The amount they crow varies considerably, and how loud they crow varies considerably. Our rooster right now, he's the only one around. Currently our neighbors don't have any chickens either. I hear him maybe once a day. But I am not aware of a quiet rooster, and I don't have any experience with the no crow collars and how effective they are either. So sorry, I'm not much help there. All right, so that looks like our final question. As a reminder, we will be sending out a link to the recording so you can view this again if there was parts that you missed, along with some different resources. It may take us a couple of days to get the recording made, but we will get it to you shortly. And then next week, you'll receive the link to session 2 from today's program series. But we thank you all for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you, Amy, for presenting.